Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. This is the first in a series of episodes that we're recording on free will and theology. And our guest today is Dan Speak, and we're going to talk with him about free will and the problem of evil.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Daniel Speak, professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Dan specializes in metaphysics and the philosophy of religion and has written extensively on free will. With Kevin Timpe, he's the co-editor of Free Will and Theism, which is a collection of essays focused on central issues of overlap between the philosophy of religion and philosophy of action. It was published in 2016 by Oxford University Press. He's the author of a book called The Problem of Evil, which was published in 2014 by Polity Press, and it's a fantastic introduction to debates about the problem of evil. Dan's also written a very helpful chapter on free will and the problem of evil for the Rutledge Companion to Free Will, and he's graciously agreed to talk to us about that topic today. So welcome to the show, Dan. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Sure, I can try, but you did a lot of the work there for me. I appreciate it. There were very nice things to say. I teach at Loyola Marymount University. That's here on the western side of LA, living large. I don't know what your guys' view is, but I'm looking out my office window right now at Marina Del Rey.
Mm-hmm. You have a nice view.
Yeah, it's like high 70s and clear. Am I making you guys jealous? Or
Yes.
I'm saying all this because we're hiring this year and we're hiring a philosopher of mind. So if there's anybody listening, I'm trying to sweeten the pot.
Nice.
So as you said, I think and teach about issues about freedom of the will and responsibility, God and evil. And, just to get a flair, I recently contributed to the Oxford Handbook of Moral Responsibility, a piece on religion and moral responsibility, where the aim of that piece is, like, you might be interested in this. The aim of that piece is to reflect on the way that religious commitment, particularly theistic commitment, might be affecting our theorizing about moral responsibility, maybe negatively, maybe positively. So there's that. I've got a new piece in the Rutledge Handbook of Forgiveness, where I'm trying to make sense of this idea. Could we forgive God? I mean, is that like, could someone be in the position such that was a coherent idea that they feel wronged by God and it would make sense for them to forgive God? So I got that kind of piece, and I got to write the four views of free will, second edition is out now.
Oh, yeah.
And I've got to review that for Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. Yeah, I reviewed it for NDPR 17 years ago.
Wow.
Oh my goodness.
And kind of fun now to be thinking about the second edition and seeing the elements that are there. And I'm actually really looking forward to that review. And so that's some of the stuff I've been up to. And I'm really, as I mentioned before to you guys, enjoying grandparenting. I got a 7-year-old grandson, 4-year-old granddaughter, and fun to be thinking about issues about freedom and development, watching them again. I mean, you guys are doing it with your kids now. I had done it with my son. Doing it as a grandparent, that's kind of a new fun thing to be seeing these little developments of agency, and when they sort of tip over into cases where you're like, man, do they have the relevant kind of control there? So remind me how old your kids are? I know yours, Taylor.
Mine are 14 and 12.
Okay. Oh, yeah. We're into agency there. We're into full on. Yeah, exactly. That's full blown. It might not be full blown morally responsible agency, but it's push back on dad agency for sure.
Totally.
Oh, my kids are closer to your grandkids in age, and they're already on pushback on dad mode. So
I guess that's right. Yeah, my grandson especially, he's got some, and he likes to make fun of grandpa too. That's taken on a so yeah. My being stinky seems to be a part of it. I think the question there, if I'm recalling, Taylor said something about how I got interested in these issues about freedom of the will. Mm-hmm. I'm a little embarrassed about this because it's not very sophisticated. I mean, you guys probably came to the issues that animate your research by way of, deep personal reflection. Mine was more like I was starting UC Riverside in the PhD program in 1996. My interests had been largely in epistemology coming in, but just through luck, the pro seminar that year was being taught by John Martin Fisher. And so John was doing a pro seminar on responsibility. There were some sort of classics of the responsibility literature. And then we actually read Robert Kane's Significance of Free Will in draft. It wasn't quite out yet. And rest in peace, Bob. I assume that's come up on the show that Bob has recently passed. We lost a great philosopher and a great person. And I got gripped by the questions in that first pro seminar. John was, of course, wonderful, and he was very encouraging. And I started to see, one of the things we're going to be thinking about in our conversation is the relationship between the free will issues and the problem of evil. I started to see those. They were kind of vaguely, I was aware of them, but when I started seeing the real issues about freedom and responsibility, they just sort of mounted like, oh, I'm actually genuinely interested in these things for themselves, the free will issues. Right. And I'm interested in them because of their application to this other problem that I care a lot about. But that came on a little bit slowly. And I really do wonder, what if somebody else had taught the pro seminar? I mean, these counterfactuals are weird, right? To know, like, I don't know. But I think some people can have the feeling like, oh, this question always gripped me or something. I kind of feel that way looking back. It's hard for me to imagine my career not being focused on these issues. But when I look at the sort of moments where it really made the difference, it seems to me like a kind of coin flipper about whether or not it had been, somebody else teaching the pro seminar.
Yeah. Very cool.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I kind of was already interested in free will, but I remember Matt and I early in our graduate careers at Florida State took a class with Al Mealy on free will and actually read the first edition of that Four Views book. And I remember getting hooked then on the issues for their own sake, not just caring about applications. So,
yeah, exactly. And Al, obviously a great teacher and a wonderful person to get inspired by the literature with. Yeah. So,
yeah.
Plus, I assume you guys shot a lot of pool and spent a lot of time at the bar.
he and I played a lot of racquetball back in the day. Yes.
I didn't know Al was a racquetball player.
Oh, yeah.
Taylor and I both were his racquetball partners for a few years.
Love it. I love it. Did you have to, was there any requirement that you lose? Was it like,
So this is part of my story is I did an MA in St. Louis and started playing racquetball with friends there. And so I thought I was pretty good. And I remember the first time we were walking from his office over to the rec center and I'm thinking in my head, like, he's, 30 years older than me. So should I let him beat me?
Yes.
Because he, I want to work with him and I want him to like me. And he proceeded to beat me probably 50 times in a row before I won a game.
Is that right? So he's good.
He's very good.
Yeah.
Now, I think Al would tolerate me asking this question in public, but that's a kind of cardiovascular output sport. Does he take a break to smoke? Is that how that goes? Sorry, Matt. I just beat you that set. I need to burn a heater and then come back in and beat you the second set. Is that how it goes?
He can make it a few games without a smoke break.
Okay, I see. Okay,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't as much of a cardiovascular experience for him as it was for me because he was so good. He could just stand in the middle of the court and make me run.
Have control. Yes, I see. Okay.
That was my experience too. Yeah. Yes. It was very humbling.
All right. Now we got to figure out how to segue from this to the problem of evil.
Natural segue.
I suffered a lot when I first started playing racquetball.
There you go. Yes.
So we've talked about the problem of evil before on this podcast, and several of our guests have said that it was thinking about this problem that got them interested in free will in the first place, and that's the case for me too. That was my gateway. Mm-hmm. But for those who aren't familiar, could you tell us a bit about what the problem of evil is?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty intuitive. I'll bet a lot of people already have a natural feel for it. And I have to say, I really can't tell how much that problem or set of problems was animating my own thinking. It feels like it was the relationship between my genuine interest in free will and then seeing almost immediately how tied up it was. It's actually hard for me to parse what was coming first in my thinking about it. But the problem itself, I mean, as I was just hinting, I don't think of the problem of evil as a single problem, but more like a family of problems that are connected together by something like this thread, that there's a philosophical tension between the account that traditional theism gives of God, especially the omni-God, call this God omnicompetent, who has all the omnis, who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. That there's a philosophical tension, or a set of philosophical tensions, different ones for different folks, between endorsing that view of God and then experiencing the actual shit the world contains, right? I mean, the world contains horrors, and you can sort of picture this. Hume called these Epicurus's old questions, right? Mm-hmm. Where Epicurus asked it roughly like this: well, look, if God's omnipotent, then he has the power to make a world without any evil, or at least eliminate it. And if God's omniscient, then like nothing's going to sneak in. There's not like, you're not going to be like, oh gosh, I didn't see that evil coming. I guess it got in the system without my knowing. And if God's omnibenevolent, then God would want there to be no evils. You'd want the world to be good in the relevant sorts of ways. And so that for there to be no innocent suffering, say, so what gives, right? You might put the question is, the philosophical puzzle here is how to reconcile the fact that God is like this, but the world is like that. And I think of that package of issues as the problems of evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the chapter in the Rutledge Handbook, you mentioned that the contemporary debate about the problem of evil, so much later than Epicurus and Hume, really got kickstarted with
not in cosmic time. Not in cosmic.
That's true. That's right. Yeah. Pretty close together in that sense. Yeah. But Mackie's article, Evil and Omnipotence. Could you say a bit about how Mackie formulated the problem and whether he said anything about free will in his discussion of it?
Yeah. I mean, that piece, it was published in 1955, and I think of it as kind of a barn burner, right? I mean, it's part of the way I think of that piece as being distinctive is that while before Mackie's essay, this problem is perennial, right? Mm-hmm. But before it, the way the problem might be framed is like as an explanatory problem, like, the theist has got this puzzle. How is it that God can exist and yet the shit show also happen? But it didn't have to impact people's conviction that there was a God, right? I mean, if you think about the traditional conflict between the tension between divine omniscience and human freedom, that's another explanatory puzzle that every thoughtful theist has had to wrestle with. But very few people in the history of the tradition thought it was grounds for not thinking there was a God, and they just thought there's just a puzzle. Like, well, how should we organize things such that so that this puzzle resolves itself? Mm-hmm. Part of what's especially potent about Mackie's Evil and Omnipotence piece in 1955 is that he formulated the tensions directly in such a way as to be a polemical attack on the existence of God, right? So what Mackie claimed in that famous piece is that the way I described it before is like there's a tension between this view about God and the omnicompetent view and the existence of evil. And what Mackie did is precify that tension into a real logical problem. So what Mackie claimed was that those things that are said about God, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and the existence of evil, that there's a logical inconsistency in endorsing all of those. That anybody who says God exists, God is omniscient, God is omnibenevolent, and God is omnipotent, and also that evil exists, Mackie's claim was that's a logically inconsistent set. So the theist, think about how powerful this claim was. Mackie notes, there were lots of people who have argued that like theistic belief was ungrounded. Why? Well, because you look at the arguments they give for theism and you can criticize them. But Mackie said this, well, there's a more powerful thing than just criticizing those arguments for theism. I can show you, he says, that the various things that the theist believes are actually incoherent. There's a logical conflict in the set of the things that the theist endorses. So in a way, I think of that as the contemporary move to a polemical version, such that after Mackie now, when someone says problem of evil, what they mean is an argument from evil that there's no God, right?
Right.
And in his case, it was very pointedly, that's because there's a kind of logical inconsistency in the system. And I think you asked there too, Taylor, about the connection to free will issues.
Yeah.
There. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of two ways in which Mackie appeals to free will or takes note of free will in that piece, because Mackie was, of course, very attuned to the idea that the most natural historical response to this kind of tension is to appeal to has been to appeal to something like freedom of the will. So he knows he's got to address it. And the two things first thing Mackie says is, and this is kind of a throwaway, and it's a little bit annoying, is that Mackie says, well, the main reason not to be very impressed with the free will response is because the notion of free will that the person's using who offers this is incoherent, he tells us. Now, he doesn't tell us about what the incoherence really involves, but we can piece it together that it's basically he's imagining a libertarian conception of free will, and he's deeply influenced by Hume. And so he's got that Humean story in mind, according to which, well, if indeterminism is true, then none of us bear the right relationship to our character features such that they can be attributable to us, right? There's a kind of obstacle between my choice, between what I'm doing and how my choices come out, such that they can't really be mine. Now, he doesn't say all of that. I think we have to piece that together. He just says, this conception is incoherent. Yeah. But then he says, ignore that. Here is the second big point, and this is the one he places all of the weight on. And it's that he thinks, let the theist have their conception, this libertarian conception of freedom of the will. Still, look, God could have made the world such that every free creature whom God has made only chose to do good things. And here's how you can see that that's got to be a possibility, because there's nothing that's stopping me right now from doing a good thing or the right thing. There's nothing stopping Matt from doing the right thing. There's nothing stopping Taylor right now from doing the right thing. And then also right in the next moment and the right in the next moment. And then he makes this inference. If there's nothing logically incoherent about me making a good choice right now or at any point along the way, then there's nothing logically incoherent in every person making the right choice, even if they're libertarianly free in the way that, you know, these wackadoodle theists want to be. So, conclusion there, it was possible for God to make a world in which every free creature only did good things. And then here's the thought. If that's right, then God should have made that world. That's the world God should have made. But we don't find that world. So there's no God, right? So, but it turns on that idea that our freedom is such that God could nevertheless have made us in such a way that we only choose right. Or maybe we should say he could have actualized a world in which we only choose right.
Yeah.
In the same Rutledge Handbook chapter that Taylor mentioned, you summarized two influential responses to the problem of evil, one from John Hick and the other from Alvin Plantinga. So could you say a bit about how Hick responded to the problem of evil and how his response involves free will?
Yeah, I mean, Hick's is you know, it was cool. So Evil and the God of Love comes out in 1966, I think was the first edition. So this is about, a little over 10 years after Mackie's piece was out. And Hick certainly knew Mackie's piece. It gets referenced. But Hick was puzzled by another element of the challenge for responding to the problem of evil. And that's that almost everybody before Hick had thought that the broadly Augustinian approach to the problem was the way to go. And what we get from going back to Augustine was the thought, a deep part of the problem is a free fall from grace, right? Human beings were in some prior state, picture Adam and Eve-ish sort of things. And they screwed things up with this robust free choice that took everything downstream badly. And so some part of the explanation for why the world is suboptimal now is because those guys screwed it up, right? Mm-hmm. Hick's thought was he didn't find this very plausible, right? And he didn't find it very plausible on some philosophical grounds, on some moral grounds, some anthropological grounds. But you could put it kind of broadly like this. you know, it doesn't look evolutionarily very plausible any longer that there was this early state of human hominids that were like very sophisticated and had their full capacities and could be in this state to be making a decision like the one that is going to have all these downstream consequences for human beings.
Mm-hmm.
He thought that story looked like it was inconsistent with what we were learning about basically evolutionary anthropology. And so his strategy was, well, what I want to try to do is respond to this problem in a way that doesn't invoke this Augustinian picture of a fall. And his strategy, which is a really cool one, he thinks he sees the seeds of it in Irenaeus, not because Irenaeus says this, but because he kind of feels like there's some hints in Irenaeus, is something like this. The history of human beings, full-on evolutionary story, earliest hominids, all this developmental stuff, is the history of God trying to bring human beings up from their initial starting points and help them to develop into the kinds of creatures that could be morally serious friends of God, right? Something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's a process that God's doing for humanity kind of cosmically, but also for each of us individually. He's trying to do the same thing for Matt. He's trying to do the same thing for Taylor, and for me. He's trying to get us to grow up so that we could join in the process of a kind of intimate, cooperative friendship with God. And then what Hick does was, and he gets that picture out, then he says, well, what kind of world would God have to make in order for that kind of process to take place? And his view is, a hedonistic paradise is not the way to go. Like, if you really want us to grow up and develop, you can't just put us in a situation in which you get everything you want and there are no obstacles, and whatever your impulses are, they're satisfied. You won't morally mature in that way. So this is why the thing that gets associated with Hick is sometimes called soul making or soul building, is that Hick's picture was, well, God would have to have the world involve a certain amount of danger, risk, obstacles, what have you, because it's only through through the process of overcoming those that we could become the kinds of seriously good beings that could be properly engaged and related to God. And so God makes a world in which, so now what's the explanation for why there's suboptimality in the world? Well, we need a certain amount of suboptimality in order for our characters to develop and for our rationality to develop in the various ways. So that's the sort of big Hick strategy. Probably we need to think about free will about that.
Yeah, how does free will fit into the picture? I guess he's probably thinking the only way to really build your character and become a serious moral friend of God would require libertarian freedom or something along those lines.
It's very yes, I think that's right. But here's where the kind of a nice little bit of subtlety where I think, there are a couple places in Hick where you're like, that's really that's a thoughtful position in a very distinctive way. And here's one of them. When he thinks about the Mackie, so I'm thinking of if consider the world that Mackie wants, where everybody is free. God's made the world such that everybody's free, but everybody's doing only what's good and right with their freedom. And call that a Mackie world, okay? Hick, unlike Plantinga, Hick thinks that God could have realized a Mackie world. But what it turns out Hick thinks is that a Mackie world isn't as good as the world in which human beings freely come to shape their own characters through these obstacles. And there's kind of a nice line from one of the editions of Evil and the God of Love, where where Hick says this: the value judgment that's implicitly being invoked here in his story is that one who has attained to goodness by meeting and eventually mastering temptations, and thus by rightly making responsible choices in concrete situations, is good in a richer and more valuable sense than would be one created ab initio in a state of either innocence or virtue. And then he tells us a little bit later that this process, as he's envisioning it, is, quote, not taking place by a natural and inevitable evolution, but through a hazardous adventure in individual freedom. And so I think the picture is just like you said there, Taylor, that
Mm-hmm.
there's something more valuable about the kind of development we can have when we freely engage in it in the face of the kinds of obstacles we face. But it's interesting because he's not saying God couldn't have made the Mackie world.
Mm-hmm.
So this is going to raise I know we want to think a little bit more about issues about value here,
Mm-hmm.
but it is sort of, to sign on to this, you probably would have to think something like, it's much better that the world have the shit show it involves and the possibilities of our deep soul making and becoming like God in these ways than the Mackie world. And it's not like the Mackie world sounds terrible, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, turning to Plantinga, who we've already mentioned, he's famous for free will defense, especially in response to Mackie's formulation of the problem. Could you give a quick summary of Plantinga's response?
It's kind of comical to give a quick summary of Plantinga's response, but
This is how many of the questions on this podcast are.
Yeah. Well, I guess. Well, so one thing to see is that in various places where Plantinga is making his sort of patented moves in response to the problem of evil, he really does have Mackie explicitly in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing to see is here, Plantinga introduces this idea of a defense. Plantinga himself had a very limited goal, and the limited goal was just this, of showing that Mackie's argument for the incoherence of the theistic set, Mackie's argument for that fails. That's all the free will defense is supposed to show, is that, think about how dramatic the claim was that we were noting that Mackie makes. Mackie says, look, the theist is contradicting herself when she endorses all of these propositions.
Mm-hmm.
And all Plantinga, I take it, wanted to show is that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
And now notice, to show that that's not right, all you have to show is possibly all of those things are true together, right? Possibly the claim God exists, is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and evil exists. Possibly they're true together. You don't have to show probably they're true or they are true together, just possibly. So all Plantinga took himself to be doing in the free will defense is trying to paint a way in which, like, let your modal judgments get a little free, and let's see if we can come up with a way in which we could show that, since Mackie is telling us there's no way for these five claims to be true together, how about just one way, right? And then his strategy is to say, like, well, here's a way. Here's a thing that's possibly true. It's possibly true that libertarian freedom is really important, right? Does it have to be true that libertarian freedom? No. Does it have to be plausible that libertarian freedom is really? No. Just, isn't it possible that libertarian freedom is really important? Grant that. And then he thinks this. Well, here's another thing. Possibly, here's a weird thing. You might think, couldn't Taylor is a very plausible candidate for this. Couldn't Taylor be such that he's what Plantinga called transworld depraved? Here's what it would be for Taylor to be transworld depraved, roughly. It would be that Taylor is such that if we put him in any world with freedom of the will, he'd do something wrong. Right? I mean, we don't know what it is. Like, Matt and I would have our theories about which things he would do wrong in the different world. But imagine he's such that, well, any world in which we place Taylor, he would freely do some bad thing. If that's true of him, then Taylor's transworld depraved. And then here was Plantinga's thought. Possibly, now no, there's just Brad, possibly every free creature is transworld depraved. And if that's right, if libertarian freedom is really, really valuable, and possibly every free creature is such that place them in some world or other, they're going to do something wrong, then for any world God would make that contains free creatures, some shit's going to go down, right? Mm-hmm. And as long as you can imagine, but if the world's good enough, it's valuable enough to have this libertarian free will, it's worth that risk, right? And then really important, just got to keep emphasizing, all of that's possibility claims, right? That's just
Yeah.
all he's trying to show is Mackie tells us these propositions can't possibly be true together. Plantinga says, well, here's a way they could possibly be true together. And if you accept that, then it's very tempting to say, okay, well, then that logical challenge fails. How much detail? Is that too much? What do you guys think?
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, I think that was good.
What about this? There's a kind of next bit that's about the Mackie stuff, right?
Mhm.
So, because it doesn't answer, you might think it doesn't answer this. There's still this looming Mackie world, right? There's still,
Yeah.
what's
Right.
the situation about this world in which, why can't God make a world in which human beings are free, but they always choose right? And here, Plantinga's strategy was to say, and here this just has to be a possibility claim too, right?
Mhm.
Is that maybe that the inference that, think about this little inference. Here's the inference. It's logically possible that every free creature go right. And then the inference is, well, since God's omnipotent, what it is to be omnipotent is just to be able to do anything, bring about any state that's logically possible. What Plantinga said is that little move from it's logically possible to an omnipotent being can just bring it out unilaterally, that
Mhm.
little move Plantinga calls Leibniz's lapse. Leibniz, he thinks, lapsed in that way too. He thinks Leibniz, you got brass ones if you're saying Leibniz is lapsing. That was a smart thing. But I do think there's a real plausibility here to the claim about the lapse. Why? Well, because here's what Plantinga claimed. If you really do think that these creatures are libertarianly free, then one thing God can't do is he can't just make it such that Matt is freely, helping his daughter with her homework. He can't make it like that, because to make it like that would be to violate its freedom.
Mhm.
So is it logically possible that Matt might freely decide to help his daughter with it? Yes. But God can't guarantee it antecedently.
Mhm.
So the big outcome of the free will defense from Plantinga's point of view was, once you see this, that the Mackie world is premised on Leibniz's lapse, not on his lap. That's a different problem. Lap, another problem. Exactly. Once you see the problem with Leibniz's lapse, then you should recognize this, that if God is going to actualize a world containing libertarianly free creatures, that world's actualization is going to have to be a cooperative project.
Mhm.
God will have to have other people, those creatures' freedom has to be part of how that world, arises. And now there's no antecedent guarantee about the way that world will go. And now you've got a reason for thinking, well, God couldn't actualize a Mackie world unilaterally. Was a Mackie world metaphysically and logically possible? Yes, but the only way it could have been actualized is if all of the people freely chose to do the right thing, not by some antecedent choice of God to make the world like that. So that's and there you can see like the fundamental role that this libertarian conception is playing. You really need that conception to be driving the idea that God couldn't have just made it so.
Yeah. So both Hick and Plantinga are relying on this libertarian conception of free will, and you've already explained a little bit. So why is it so important that it's libertarian free will for their projects?
Good. I mean, I take it you guys are going to reflect on this a bit further in nearby episodes about the possibility of a compatibilist free will defense. So that'll be fun. I'll be looking forward to hearing that. I think Jason Turner maybe is joining you guys. He's great.
That's right.
I love his piece on this. But here's the intuitive idea. The intuitive idea is, well, imagine that the kind of freedom that we enjoy is compatibilist freedom. What's that mean? Well, that means that I can be free even though the laws of nature and the past determine some singular trajectory of the future. All my actions can be antecedently determined, and I can still be free, provided the compatibilist conditions are met. Then here's the intuitive idea. Like, if that's the freedom that we're talking about, it should have been easy for God to make a Mackie world.
Yeah.
Right. It would have been so easy because you don't have to worry about their freedom going haywire. Just make sure that you set up the initial conditions of the world deterministically, so their unfolding goes exactly where you want, as God wants, and then just build in that how it unfolds. It just has, Taylor freely helping the woman across the street, and Matt freely deciding to save the child from the drowning pond, and you can just build that in. And then someone wants, but they're not free. Like, what are you talking about? They meet all the compatibilist conditions for freedom. There's nothing. The fact that they're determined is not a relevant feature for why they're free or unfree, because their freedom has to do with the proper relationship between their inner states and their decisions, or whatever it might be. And so the intuitive idea, that's the one that I think Jason wants to challenge, and that it's a really important challenge. But the intuitive idea is, if the kind of freedom we're talking about here is compatibilist, it seems too easy for God to have gotten a Mackie world or something at least as good.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you kind of hinted that we were going to come to this a bit earlier, but appeals to free will in response to the problem of evil seem to depend on free will being valuable. So it's got to be like worth it for God to permit evil in order to allow for free will. So why would free will be this valuable? And what are some ways that maybe some dissenters push back against the idea that it is that valuable?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I do think for me, as someone who cares a lot about these issues about freedom of the will and the problem of evil, this is getting close to a real nub for me about value issues. Because if free will better be really valuable, if it's going to do the kind of work for justifying Ebola in South Africa and the horrors that our world contains in general. And those can be very hard to see. But when you do get a glimpse of them, I mean, the one big one that almost everybody accepts and that seems to animate so much of the contemporary free will debate is just the nature of moral responsibility. So one thing just seems like, I mean, there's this connection between being free and being subject to moral assessment, and making it appropriate for me to complain about you when you wrong me, and maybe to punish you. But even beyond that, like you might just think the kind of the structure of our lives together as morally responsible agents seems to turn on these judgments about freedom. So that's a really high value. If it's true, if that connection is there, that's a really high value. So those are maybe, fairly familiar. But here are some others that have come out in the literature that strike me as not totally implausible. Like, I think it's intuitive that there's a kind of unique value to creative achievement, making great art, writing a song, writing poetry, doing inventive, creative philosophy. That seems to me like the creativity has a value when it's free. That if you find out that it's got some coercive aspect to it, or if you find out that it was merely luck, it was just the monkeys, randomly tapping, you lose the judgment that this creative output, you might still if the monkeys just slap things together and you get Van Gogh's irises, I might still well, that is lovely, but there's a way in which it's stopped being as powerful a thing if it's not an expression of a certain kind of free engagement. So that seems like an important value. There might be a closely related one here about the meaningfulness of our lives, right? It can feel to some degree like part of what gives my life its sense of its meaningfulness. Of course, this is a very deeply debated issue, but this doesn't seem crazy, is the fact that I'm leading it from a free position. It's almost as if, John talks like this sometimes, right? John Fisher, that like the leading of a life and the idea of writing a story or creating some master work, there's a kind of a correlation between those things in such a way that you might think, well, the meaningfulness of my life, what what gives it this additional value besides it's just being morally good or bad or what have you, of being meaningful, could be connected to freedom in ways that strike me as not totally implausible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also do think, closely related here, that at least certain forms of mature love strike me as having the structure whereby the love between my wife and I, Matt's just celebrating his 20th anniversary. The love between he and his wife. I by the way, as a libertarian, but who hangs around with a lot of compatibilists, my impulse is not to say, "Hey, if determinism turns out to be true, Matt doesn't love his wife." I don't. That's not my. But I don't like. I'm not deflationary about these things. But I do feel some temptation to say, it will be better. It is better for if Matt's love for his wife and her love for him has a kind of freedom that's expressed by the fact that the universe didn't guarantee it from the outset, and it's in them and it flows from them. There's a deeper kind of respectable and honorable and valuable love if it's like that. So I feel all of those as kind of reasons for thinking. Now, does that add up to enough value to counteract, children dying of the Ebola virus in West Africa? I don't know, but those are the kinds of things that I would find myself appealing to.
Right. Yeah.
And the pushbacks. I mean, you guys had Dirk Paraboom on?
We have. It's been a while. And I don't know that we talked about problem of evil.
Okay.
But
well, you might think even independently, like if you think about his skeptical, his overall hard incompatibilism, the way I sometimes am pitching it when I'm talking to students about it is like, well, the Paraboom view is we're not free and responsible, but it's not so bad, right?
Yeah.
Right? It's not a big deal. And part of the way he gets at it's not being that big of a deal is think about these values I've just announced here about responsibility and creativity and meaningfulness and love. And in various ways, Dirk's efforts are trying to say, look, you don't have to have freedom and responsibility to have at least analogs of some of those, and maybe the full thing on others of them. And, just for what it's worth, when I hear Dirk on those things, I also think he's often extremely smart and it's not quite as straightforward, but what it seems to me that is in all of these, there's like a deep core of value that is lost if we aren't free.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So do you think there's any other facets of this debate that maybe we should have asked about to introduce how free will comes up in discussions of the problem of evil? Or are there any recent developments that you think are worth noting as we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm definitely not the should thing. I have no normative assessment of you guys as with respect to your judgments about choices. I mean, things I think are really interesting and important and strike me as plausibly important here. In general, one of my modes about the issues about freedom, and then they directly connect to the issues about problem of evil, is to think that we have to go back to the axiological foundations a bit here. That a lot of have you talked at all about this idea? John Fisher's got this idea of dialectical stalemates.
Mm-hmm.
Has that ever come? You get these places where competing views. I mean, it would if almost certainly if Taylor and I started talking about Frankfurt cases, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'd get to a place pretty quickly where Taylor's got a judgment about the cases and a set of intuitions about how they go that just there's a fundamental nub where I see what you're saying. I think that's wrong. And you think I'm wrong about this core thing. And it just looks like we can't make any progress. We're at this stalemate where the only way, there's another way you might put it. The only way for us to make, for us to make headway is I would have to beg the question against Taylor to get it going, or he would have to beg the question against me. You just hit these. And my sense is that there are so many of these places in the free will literature where we were at stalemates that I recommend reflecting more deeply and afresh on the values. I really like the fact that you asked the question about value, which is naturally connected to the problem of evil, but it might be just good to reflect on in the problem itself, how much of what's happening in these stalemates is coming from disagreements about axiology at a deeper level, that maybe if we unpacked that, could we chip away? Could we make a little bit more progress? Because when it's happening at the level of the theories about, how much knowledge Black has with respect to what Jones is doing, or if you think about Paraboom's four-case argument, like new tweaks to the four-case argument or new moves in the consequence argument, my inclination is to think we shook that tree, right? The fruit fell out of that tree, of those trees, and we're going to have to go down to the root and reflect again on, like, why do we care about freedom, and how could we best preserve it, et cetera. And then just one point about that is, I find attractive, and I'm really interested, especially since I announced this, that some of my initial intuitions, initial motivations in philosophy had to do with epistemology. Mm-hmm. I think these new movements for pragmatic encroachment in epistemology and moral encroachment in epistemology are really fun and interesting. And, remember, those cases are supposed to show something like this, that it may be that the two people could be identically related, or identically positioned with respect to the evidence of some proposition, right? Mm-hmm. The proposition that the bank's going to be open, or Matt's asking, can he take this tax deduction, right? And he's asking me, can I take this tax deduction? And because I'm older, right? I'm let's say aged, even. Let's go that far. And Matt thinks, well, Dan's paid a lot of taxes. Dan, and you're an academic, I'm an academic. Hey, can I take this deduction? And I say, yeah, you can. I actually I took that deduction the last 2 years, no trouble. And Taylor hears that, right? And so you guys both get the same evidence. But the difference is, if Matt screws this up, nothing. He'll get a little note back from the IRS saying, hey, you can't take this deduction. But Taylor's already been jacking with the IRS for a long time, and they've got his. And if he gets this wrong, he's got jail time coming, right? The pragmatic encroachment theorists say, well, it may be that Matt, in fact, knows he can take the deduction. Taylor does not know. But there's no difference in their evidence. The only difference is in their practical context. What's at stake? I think that's really illuminating, and that what I would like to see more of is, I'd like to see some of that, the moral and pragmatic encroachment, come into the free will literature, such that we're reflecting on what should we be believing about freedom. So that's a separate question. Do we have free will? Then there's what should we believe about our having free will, where the pragmatic encroachment stuff brings value into the epistemology in what I think could be a new and illuminating way. I'm super interested in that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Cool. Well, thanks again, Dan, for joining us. This has been a great conversation. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
First, they shouldn't follow my work. They should follow smart people's work. So we've already mentioned, Dirk Paraboom. We've mentioned John Fisher a couple of times. We've mentioned Al Mealy. That's the work you should. Robert Cain, in light of his passing, go read Robert Cain. If you absolutely had to, for some pathetic reason, follow my work, I have an academia.edu page with a lot of things on it that people could find. But I'm also happy to have people, send emails if they want to check in, and nice. Be happy to send things, folks. And since I mentioned that point about being the graduate director here in our little MA program, if you got folks out there who are thinking about doing MAs, not quite ready for a PhD program, but would like to try to get ready, we'd be a fun place to come.
Yeah.
Nice.
Got a great view.
Yeah, totally.
I'll just show you. I know your listeners won't be able to see, but can you see it out there?
That's fantastic.
Very nice.
Not bad, right? Yeah. I said I'm looking over Marina Del Rey. I am. If the marina is the water, then I don't see that. Just so you know. But I do see the boats. I do see the sails.
So that clarification. Yeah,
that's enough.
So that's enough. Be clear. Right,
yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks again, Dan.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
In our next episode, we'll talk about compatibilism and the free will defense against the problem of evil. And our guest, as mentioned, will be Jason Turner, professor of philosophy at the University of Arizona.